modern European philosophy of the 17th, 18th century. That's the subject of today's lecture. First, I'd like to know that the real beginnings of modern philosophy was marked by the Age of Reason of the 17th century and the Age of Enlightenment of the 18th century, along with advances in science and the growth of religious tolerance and the rise of liberalism. And philosophical approaches show the trends towards secularization and rationalization. These are the most common and widely spread trends at the beginning of the Age of Reason, and philosophy tends to become free from any kind of irrational and unreflective preconditions. It becomes more critical, rational, and reflective discipline. I'd like to quote Professor Lawrence Calhoun. That's a quote from his lecture on modern philosophy. He notes that modern philosophy, beginning in the 16th and 17th century, marked a major departure from medieval thought. Throughout the Age of Reason in the 17th century, scientific change forced philosophers to reconceive the world and how we know it. And the new sciences overturned the Aristotle and Ptolemaic science that had been woven together with Christianity. And this period led to the 18th century, the Enlightenment, when science, education, and political freedom were believed to be the keys to remaking society. Okay, so what were the characteristic features of philosophical discourse in this Age of Reason? Many philosophers embraced the establishment of the status of natural sciences, and they appreciated their cognitive investment to the progress of civilization. Just recall Francis Bacon's famous slogan, "Knowledge is power." So positive scientific knowledge is considered to be the power of progressive innovation of social life. And philosophy tends to elaborate new rational approaches, new methodological approaches on the basic problems of metaphysics, theory of knowledge, and ethics. In the field of theory of knowledge, for instance, philosophers worked at the strategies that would enable to identify and expose main natural sources of knowledge. The sources of knowledge are posed in natural light of reason, and modern philosophers turn to the problem of the reflectively distinct ways and universal conditions of cognitive activity, and they focused on the study of the role of rational reflection or empirical evidence, experience, and all other sources that contributed to the development of knowledge, which is based on the natural light of reason. And there was made a good start of philosophical competition in search of the proper and efficient method of scientific and metaphysical research. The most prominent philosophers of the early modern period are the rationalists and the empiricists. Among the prominent rationalists are as follows: René Descartes, Benedictus Spinoza, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Among the empiricists, the most influential were such philosophers as Francis Bacon, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, George Berkeley, and of course David Hume. What marks the difference between these two currents in modern philosophical thought? Rationalism is the view that reason, as opposed to sense experience and divine revelation or reliance on institutional authority, plays a dominant role in our attempt to gain knowledge. And empiricism stresses the fundamental role of experience. It treats human mind as tabula rasa, and it is experience which furnishes our mind with the cognitive available impressions and ideas, so the material which can be processed in order to generate knowledge. So as a doctrine in epistemology, empiricism holds that all knowledge is ultimately based on experience. Let's first consider the main features of classical rationalism, main features of rationalist view on the generation of knowledge and on the method of gaining knowledge. First, rationalists such as René Descartes laid emphasis on intuition, that is called rational intuition, and deduction. So that means that some propositions are knowable by us by intuition alone, through rational grasp of the truth of those propositions, which turn out to be evident, and others propositions are knowable by being deduced from intuitive propositions, which form a kind of axiomatic basis for the subsequent deductive arguments. Some rationalists take intuition to be infallible, claiming that whatever we input must be true. Others allow for the possibility of false intuitive propositions. Anyway, René Descartes established rather high epistemological standards, and he thought that that which is given to us through rational intuition must be true. At least it must be resistant to any rational doubt. Some rationalists also claim that only mathematics can be knowledge which is gained through intuition and deduction. Beside that, rationalists tend to believe that, for instance, ethical truths can also be intuited. They are of a priori value. And some more radical rationalists maintain that a whole range of metaphysical claims, like the existence of God, for instance, or just free will and the reality of mind and body, they should be included within the range of intuition and deduction, and that can be grasped on the basis of intuition and the subsequent deductive procedures. Beside that, some of the rationalists believe that there is innate knowledge. We have knowledge of some truths as part of our innate rational nature. We can treat this innate knowledge as a kind of cognitive disposition to form certain kind of propositions which are highly likely to be true. Experience may trigger a process by which we bring this knowledge to consciousness, but the experiences don't provide us with the knowledge itself. And knowledge has in some way been with us all along. And some rationalists claim that we gain this innate knowledge in an early existence. And that is a Platonic trend in rationalist thought. Some rationalists also believe that God provided us with it at creation. Others believe that it is part of our nature through natural selection. Innate concepts, a priori concepts, that's another item within the framework of our cognitive apparatus. Some of the concepts, as opposed to actual knowledge, we employ are part of our innate rational nature. Some rationalists would argue, however, that innate concepts are entailed by innate knowledge, because a particular instance of knowledge can only be innate if the concepts that are contained in the proposition are also innate. And the knowledge we gain by intuition and deduction, as well as the ideas and instances of knowledge that are innate to us, are indispensable and could not have been gained through sense experience. So reason is superior, and that is why we call those philosophers who adhere to this view rationalists. Among the rationalists, the most prominent and influential figure was René Descartes. René Descartes is considered to be the father of modern philosophy. He intended to formulate a methodology that applies to all the sciences, so he believed in a universal method of science. He noted that all sciences are all nothing but human wisdom, which always remains one and the same, however much its objects may differ. And the sciences are so interconnected and interdependent that it is easier to learn them together than separately. And what someone seeking truth in the sciences must first do is to consider how to increase his natural light of reason, the cognitive abilities he is naturally endowed with. René Descartes elaborated the conception of philosophical method and the concept of philosophical truth as well. So the problem of method was a very urgent problem at the time of the intensive growth of scientific knowledge. How to conduct our reason when we seek truth in the sciences. Descartes offered 4 rules that he said he found sufficient in this search. First, never accept anything as true which you didn't know evidently to be true, including nothing in your judgments except what has presented itself so clearly and distinctly to your mind that you have no reason to doubt it. That's the first standard. The standard which imposes the requirement of certain ideas being presented so clearly and distinctly to the mind that it would preclude any possibility of doubt. The second rule, divide the difficulties you are examining into as many parts as possible. The third rule, conduct your thoughts in an orderly way, beginning with the simplest objects and ascending gradually to the most complex. The fourth rule, make enumeration so complete and reviews so comprehensive that you are sure you hadn't left anything out. So the first rule can be qualified as the rule of certainty. The second rule can be qualified as the rule of analysis. The third rule can be characterized as the rule of synthesis, and this final fourth rule can be qualified as the rule of enumeration and reflective control over your deductive reasoning. That is what is now called Cartesian method, and this method was to check off everything about which there could be even a suspicion of doubt, including the unreliable senses in his own body, which could be merely an illusion, and to arrive at the single indubitable principle. So Descartes was the first to raise the question of how we can claim to know with certainty anything about the world around us. In his work entitled Meditations on the First Philosophy, Descartes claims that philosophical search for the main grounds of knowledge must begin with ridding ourselves of all past beliefs, just purifying our mind. Descartes assumed that if a belief survives a thorough attempt to doubt it, it will qualify as indubitable and provide a proper foundation for reconstructing our system of beliefs. That was in accord with his standard of certainty. So Descartes was a foundationalist and rationalist at the same time. So Descartes claims to find his Archimedean point, a proposition that resists all attempts to doubt it, and he finds this Archimedean point. The initial certainty is the existence of the self. There appears to be the famous inference, I think, therefore I exist. That is what is called Descartes' cogito argument. We can reconstruct this argument, which Descartes proposed in search for the certain foundations of knowledge as follows. I have doubt of the reality of the external world and of my having a body and being a part of that world. If I have doubt of anything, then I think of it. To think it is necessary to exist. I think because I have doubt, and doubting something means to exercise an act of thinking. Therefore I exist. The Latin version is as follows: cogito ergo sum. So this method of doubt was introduced in Descartes' work Meditations on the First Philosophy. If we are to establish anything in the sciences that is stable and likely to last, we must demolish all our ordinary opinions and start right from the foundations. And René Descartes starts with examining different kinds of propositions. First, he examines the propositions which we recognize on the basis of our sense experience. But first, he acknowledged the fact that our senses can deceive us, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So the meditator considers common cases of sense deception as a ground of doubt. But eventually the meditator dismisses them because they support doubts only about small and distant objects, not a more general doubt about all material objects. The next stage in this argument, the next stage in the development of this argument is focused on drawing skeptical implications from the assumptions about the state of dreaming. They may be dreams, Descartes notes, dreams in which we can represent things to ourselves or just as convincingly as our senses now do, but which bear no relation to reality. Each night, when we fall asleep, we dream. In those dreams, we have experiences just as vivid as our most vivid waking experiences, or at least if there is a difference between our dreams and our most vivid waking experiences, it is not discernible during the dream. That's the argument. We can assume that, for instance, right now, we still are in the state of dream. We are dreaming right now. So it is possible for all we know that we are dreaming now, no matter how convincingly our present experience seems to be. That is the application of the method of doubt. It is not the road which leads to skepticism. The idea is not to just undermine the foundations of knowledge, but to find something which would resist all doubts, to found certain foundations of knowledge. Going further, Descartes also considers such an objection that dreams are like paintings. A painter can rearrange scenes, but ultimately depicts things derived from real things upon the real colors. So by similar reasoning, even if familiar things, our eyes, hands, head, and so on, are imaginary, they must depend on some simple and more universal things that are real. But the meditator goes further. On further reflection, the meditator realizes that even simple things can be doubted. For instance, we can assume that omnipotent God could make even our conception of mathematics false. And this idea was reiterated in the form of evil demon argument. Let's consider evil demon argument. If we suppose that there is no God, that there is even if we suppose that there is no God, then there is even greater likelihood of being deceived, since our imperfect senses wouldn't have been created by a perfect being. So Descartes supposed that not God, but some evil demon has committed itself to deceiving him, so that everything he thinks he knows is false. And by doubting everything, he can at least be sure not to be misled into falsehood by this demon. At this stage, as Descartes argued, I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning, has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which has devised to ensnare my judgment. Just compare this existential situation with that which is presented in a movie called Matrix, as if we live in a simulated reality. Descartes thinks that there is not one of my former beliefs about which a doubt may not properly be raised. For the sake of the inquiry, Descartes is supposing that I have no senses and no body. These assumptions are quite coherent. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? Even if I suppose that I have no senses and no body, this will not lead me to recognition of the fact that I do not exist, because in this case there is a contradiction. If I conceive myself of something, then I certainly existed. But there is a deceiver of supreme power, evil demon and cunning, who is deliberate and constantly deceiving me. In that case, I too undoubtedly exist. If he is deceiving me, and let him deceive me as much as he can, he will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I think that I am something. So after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist. So Descartes claims that he has found his Archimedean point, a proposition that resists all attempts to doubt it. And on the basis of this proposition, he believes that he can build his revised system of beliefs. So the initial certainty is the existence of the self. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist. That's the Latin version here of this famous formula. Now let's consider the further step, how René Descartes reconstitutes the world. Descartes then worked to reconstitute the world again according to his own strict rules. The existence of the external world is the focus of the last series of arguments in the Meditations. Descartes further reasoned that the essence of material substances is, if it exists, is spatial extension. Matter takes up space, mind doesn't take up space, thought has no space, an idea has no volume, no width, no breadth. If Descartes had stopped here, he would have been a solipsist. But Descartes then managed to prove that the content of my mind implies its creation by an infinite perfect being, and since such being couldn't be a deceiver, the material universe must exist. And Descartes sets out a causal argument for the existence of God. That's the first and necessary step in this project of reconstituting the world. This argument relies on the scholastic causal principle. The causal principle can be formulated as follows. It stands to reason that a cause must be at least as great as its effect. Otherwise, how could it produce the effect? It follows that we can get something from nothing, or the perfect from the imperfect. So Descartes goes on to argue that among the contents of our mind, we've got the idea of God, which in itself can be taken as proof of the existence of God. Descartes argues as follows: since I have a clear and distinct idea of a perfect infinite being, God, such an idea, with perfect and infinite content, could only be produced by a cause with perfect and infinite reality, namely God. So God exists. So in this argument, he relies on this famous scholastic causal principle. So therefore God exists. Then Descartes goes on and he argues that if we have the overwhelming impression of the existence of a concrete world around us, as we do, then an omniscient, and omnibenevolent God could ensure that such a world does in fact exist for us. So Descartes argued that the things in the external world are material because God wouldn't deceive him as the ideas that are being transmitted, and has given him the propensity to believe that such ideas are caused by material things. And because of this belief that God is benevolent and doesn't desire to deceive him, he can therefore have some faith in the account of reality his senses provide him. Yet Descartes dismissed the senses and perception as unreliable and came to the conclusion that reason and deduction is the only reliable method of attaining knowledge. Nevertheless, he reconstituted the world on the basis of these assumptions that were transformed into premises of deductive argument. Descartes separated mind and body utterly. He considered mind and body to be two distinct kinds of substance. So there are two different kinds of substances. The mind or soul is independent of the physical world of matter and motion, the science studies. And the distinction between the mind and the body, this dualism, follows directly from the cogito argument. The meditator examines his basic beliefs. Among these are the beliefs that has both a body and a soul, and the belief that there are bodies and the external world cannot survive radical doubt. The cogito argument, I think, therefore exists, proves that the only thing he can be certain of is the existence of the self. For the very act of doubting that I am thinking entails that I am thinking, since doubt is a species of thought. And the self, whose existence the meditator cannot doubt, is nothing but something spiritual. It is not something corporeal. I cannot conceive myself except as thinking. I can find no other property besides thought which belongs to my essence. It is of my essence to think. And Descartes clearly establishes the existence of the self as a thinking thing, a mind, a substance, which is incorporeal. Scholars know that in parallel texts, in the discourse and method and the principles, Descartes suggests that the cogito establishes the existence of a thinking substance distinct from the body. So mind and body turn out to be distinct because they can exist apart from one another. However, in this life, they do not exist apart from one another, and Descartes made serious attempts to explain the intimate relation between mind and body, and that relationship is manifested in the facts of everyday experience. For instance, nature teaches by our sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that we are not merely present in our bodies as sailors are present in the ship, but that we're very closely and as it were intermingled with body, so that I and the body form a unit. Bodily sensations are nothing but confused modes of thinking arising from the union of mind and body, and it is not clear that this doctrine of mind-body union is compatible with the doctrine that mind and body are distinct. And contemporaries of René Descartes were puzzled by his admission, and once Descartes was asked how the soul could be affected by the body and vice versa, given the supposed radical difference in the natures, Descartes answered that the point was difficult to explain, but he also noted that our own inner experience was so clear that it couldn't be gainsaid. So in his work Passions of the Soul, Descartes introduced a kind of causal naturalistic explanation. The mind is joined to the body in one specific place, the pineal gland, a single gland in the center of the brain, between the two lobes. This is the spot in which interaction takes place, and the mind has the ability to move the pineal gland and by doing so to change the state of the brain in such ways to produce voluntary emotions. And similarly, the sensory organs all transmit their information to the pineal gland, and as a result of that, sensation is transmitted to the attached mind. But this causal naturalistic explanation can hardly be acknowledged as being consistent and satisfactory. So that is mind-body dualism, or Cartesian dualism. And this dualism set the agenda for philosophical discussion of the mind-body problem for centuries after. Let's turn to metaphysics. In the field of metaphysics, or theory of being, early modern philosophy is engaged in a critical reconsideration of the main ideas that constitute the core of the fundamental views of reality, such as the idea of God, the idea of human being, the idea of nature and of world as a whole. And modern philosophy tends to work out strategies of making certain what is real and to give theoretical exposition of fundamental structures of reality. And we have seen that René Descartes, for instance, explicated the structure of reality in terms of two distinct substances, corporeal and spiritual. Among the most prominent approaches of modern philosophers in the field of metaphysics, there were dualistic approaches, as we have already seen, monistic approaches, and even pluralistic approaches. Let's turn to Benedictus Spinoza. He was another great figure of rationalism. Spinoza presented himself as a follower of René Descartes, but Spinoza overcame this substantial dualism. Spinoza developed a very interesting and influential theory, which is now qualified as a metaphysical theory based on the principle of substantial monism. Spinoza's major work was the monumental Ethics, Ethica Ordine Geometrica Demonstrata. In ethics, Spinoza used a Euclidean geometrical method to present one of the great rationalist metaphysical systems of the 17th century. Spinoza's own metaphysical system is characterized by the systemic account of metaphysical principles which involved the critical reconsideration of mind-body dualism in favor of a kind of substantial monism. So according to Spinoza, mind, which has the capacity of thinking, and body, which is characterized by material extension, the substantial property of any corporeal entity, were just two different aspects or attributes of a single underlying substance, which might be called nature. And this nature Spinoza also equated with God, infinitely many, God which has infinitely many attributes. And only two of these attributes are accessible to our understanding. That is the attribute of thinking and the attribute of extension. Spinoza was a thoroughgoing determinist who believed that absolutely everything, even human behavior, occurs through the operation of necessity, leaving absolutely no room for free will and spontaneity. Let's consider substance monism. Substance monism is the complex thesis that there is only one ultimate reality, there is only one substance in the universe, the substance which can be identified with God or nature. First, we have to explicate the very concept of substance. Substance is defined as what is in itself and is conceived through itself. Substance is an infinite causal act. Substance is a being of infinitely many attributes, and of these attributes, extension and thought were those attributes that we can understand. Though there are infinitely many attributes, but only two of these attributes are conceivable by humans. Attribute is defined as that which the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. And all of reality was really just one substance. And all apparently different objects were merely facets or aspects or modes of that underlying substance. Mode is defined as the affections of a substance, or that which is another, that which is in another, through which also it is conceived. So Spinoza, in contrast to Descartes, consistently maintains that there is only one substance, God, and thought and extension are among its attributes, and there are infinitely many attributes, infinitely many faces of one and the same reality, which is called substance. And within each attribute, the modes of God are of two kinds. There are infinite modes, which are pervasive features of each attribute, such as the laws of nature, and finite modes, which are local and limited modifications of substance. For instance, our particular material things are finite modes, as well as our ideas or thoughts in our mind. And there's an infinite sequence of finite modes. Spinoza's theory of knowledge is very interesting and original. Though to a large extent he relied on the intuitions of René Descartes, but he employed also a set of concepts which he borrowed from scholastic classical thought. First, Spinoza distinguishes two representational faculties, the imagination and the intellect. The imagination is a faculty of forming imagistic representations of things derived ultimately from the mechanisms of the senses. And the intellect is a faculty of forming adequate, non-imagistic conceptions of things. So Spinoza also distinguished three kinds of knowledge. The first is the lowest kind of knowledge. It is called opinion or imagination. Opinion or imagination includes random or indeterminate experience, knowledge from mere science. It thus depends on the confused and mutilated deliverances of the senses and is inadequate. The second kind of knowledge is reason, ratio. It depends on common notions, features of things that are common to all and equally in the part and in the whole, or on adequate knowledge of the properties as opposed to the essence of things. And the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge. It proceeds from adequate knowledge of the essence or attributes of God to knowledge of the essence of things, and hence proceeds in the proper order from causes to effects. Both the second and the third kinds of knowledge are adequate. The third kind is preferable, however, because it involves not only certain knowledge that something is so, but also knowledge of how and why it is so. So the knowledge of the causes. And the highest course, which we should know, at least this motivates our cognitive activity to get the knowledge of causes and ultimately to get the knowledge of the most fundamental cause is substance of God. Amor Dei intellectualis, intellectual love of God, is what helps us to sustain our existence and to progress in our cognitive and practical activities. Spinoza was a substantial monist, but there was another philosopher, a rationalist, who adhered to the view which can be now qualified as substantial pluralism. That was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Let's consider the major ideas of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a German philosopher, mathematician, scientist, and polymath of the age of reason. His major work was monadology. Leibniz devised a metaphysical theory of monads, operating according to a pre-established divine harmony. So let's consider the overall structure of the world as it was explicated in monadology. The real world is actually composed of eternal, non-material and mutually independent elements, monads. And the material world actually just phenomena, appearances, phenomena beta fundatum, according to Leibniz, well-founded phenomena, byproducts of the underlying real world of monads. The apparent harmony prevailing among monads arises because of the will of God, the supreme monad. God arranged everything in the world in a deterministic manner. For instance, there are lots of clocks in the world, and it is God who makes these clocks be synchronized. That is what is called a pre-established divine harmony. And Leibniz also saw this as overcoming the problematic interaction between mind and matter, which arose in Descartes' system. Leibniz declared that we live in the best possible world simply because it was created and determined by a perfect God. Actually, Leibniz is the father-founder of the possible world analysis. Let's consider some of the most important principles of this substantial pluralistic theory, labeled as monadology. Leibniz asserts that the basic individuals of an acceptable ontology are all monads. Monads are the ultimate elements of the universe. They are eternal, immaterial, indecomposable, individual, and non-interacting entities. Monads' most basic properties are function of their perceptions and appetites. Monads are subject to their own laws, just like living cells or small living organisms. Each monad perceives all the other monads with varying degrees of clarity, except for God, who perceives all monads with utter clarity. And unlike atoms, monads possess no material or spatial character, and they are completely mutually independent, so that interactions among monads are only apparent. Monads have no windows. God creates, conserves, and concurs in the actions of each created monad, and each state of created monad is a causal consequence of its preceding state, except for its state at creation and any of its states due to miraculous divine causality. And human beings and even God himself are monads, or aggregates of monads. The existence of God can be inferred from the harmony prevailing among all other monads. It is God who wills to establish harmony. And the external world is ideal and phenomenal. And its motion is the result of dynamic force, the pre-established harmony or effect of the God on these simple and immaterial monads. That was a really influential theory in the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, monadology. And Leibniz opposed to Newton in the explication of the concept of space. Leibniz insisted that space is a relational concept. So he opposed to Newtonian's absolutist concept of space. And another peculiar feature of Leibniz's philosophy was that he reinvented and reconsidered some of the concepts and terms introduced by Aristotle in his metaphysics. For instance, he introduced the concept of teleology. Telos is goal or purpose. Simply, he reinvented the idea of final causes in the universe. This objective teleology now can be considered in terms of the genetic determination of the evolution of organisms or living beings. So it really does make sense to talk about objective teleology, but we should give it the proper interpretation. The correct interpretation depends on how we use the more fundamental concepts. So we can project this theory onto the biological account of the structure and the function of a living organism. Leibniz was a typical rationalist, but there was an alternative current in the thought of modern philosophers, empiricism. Empiricism is different from rationalism. First, we shall consider empiricism in terms of the explanation of the origin of knowledge. Empiricism is the paradigmatic view that all knowledge or all meaningful discourse about the world is related to sensory experience, including inner sense or introspection. And boundaries of possible Sense experiences are the boundaries of possible knowledge. So empiricism emphasizes the role of experience and evidence, especially sensory perception, the formation of ideas. And the empiricists argued that the only knowledge humans have is a posteriori or based on experience. And empiricism relies on induction or inductive reasoning in order to build a more complex body of knowledge from these basic elements acquired through, for instance, observations. The classical empiricists were mainly British philosophers. They are as follows: Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. We'll start analyzing the views of empiricists, and first we'll turn to Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a typical empiricist. He was an English philosopher, statesman, essayist, and scientist. And he was the first among the philosophers of the Age of Reason who argued for the application of inductive reasoning, the approach used by modern science. He's the author of a set of works and essays, but Bacon's most essential work was the New Organon, the new instrument or method for acquiring useful knowledge. The New Organon had four essential themes. Knowledge is human power. Knowledge is the ability to navigate, to grow crops, to avoid human starvation. Knowledge is the source of our cognitive and practical activity. It is the tool of improving our life. Knowledge is the basis for the growth of civilization. Second, natural philosophy, science, must be separated from theology. Natural philosophers or theologians shouldn't interfere in each other's disciplines. Third, the method of induction, just from particular observations to generalizations. This method is the method which leads us to getting knowledge of the propositions which are tested by experiment. And the question is not what follows from a given axiom, but what follows from observing the particulars of the world. And this is the method of processing the data of our experience. Science is a dynamic, cooperative, cumulative enterprise. Science is always self-correcting. And the only knowledge of importance to man was empirically rooted in the natural world, and a clear system of scientific inquiry would ensure man's mastery over the world. Francis Bacon, as well as René Descartes, was really concerned with purifying our mind. Philosopher must free his mind from certain false assumptions or false dispositions or false concepts which distort the truth. Among these false notions, there are as follows. We call them idols. The idols of the tribe are inherent in human nature. For instance, we tend to project the structure of our thoughts about natural phenomena onto the realm of natural phenomena themselves. And that means that in such cases we fall under the influence of the idols of the tribe. We simply make false generalizations. The idols of the cave are the particular biases of the individual man, which derive from education, psychology, need. The idols of the marketplace. These are semantic difficulties, the ambiguity of words, the currency of which knowledge is traded. and the idols of the theater. That means that we still under the influence of philosophical tradition, and scholastics, for instance, enjoyed this theater of thought. They were compared with spiders, generating ideas and abstract systems out of mind without any relation to experience, without any relation to the natural world. Francis Bacon introduced his method as the method of induction in the second book of his work, the known organon, or the new organon. Let's consider this method which was proposed by Francis Bacon, the method of scientific investigation. The first stage in any investigation is the gathering together of a natural and experimental history. Bacon's examples include histories of the rainbow, fauna, and the wax, and natural histories record not only material gathered from the ordinary workings of nature, but also novel phenomena generated by human activity. So nature was to be put to the question, and the human understanding needed to be purged and cleansed. This had to be done by an immersion into the world of experience in its variety. And Bacon was a nominalist. Followed this nominalist tradition, individuals alone are real, and our most reliable cognitions are our direct sensory awareness of individuals. And the research has to begin with particulars. We have also to begin with a full range of particulars as possible. Bacon proposed the method which was based on the idea of using free tables for the appropriate cognitive processing of empirical data. Bacon proposed and exposed the method of free tables, and this method can be reduced to the following stages. First, we should employ a table of essence and presence. We should list all the situations in which the nature under investigation is present. Second, then we use a table of deviation or absence in proximity. We should describe all those situations which are as close as possible to those in the first table, but where the nature under investigation is absent. And finally, a table of degrees or comparison, a list of those situations where the nature in question varies in intensity together with details of the circumstances accompanying that variation. Tables and experiment. When first table drawn up, the second and the third tables would both be incomplete in that they would contain gaps corresponding to entries in the first. And one of the chief functions of experiment was to remedy these defects, to fill in the gaps in table entries. And let's consider the overall inductive process. When the tables have been drawn up, it is possible to begin the inductive process itself. The first work, therefore, of true induction is the rejection or exclusion of the several natures which are not found in some instance when the given nature is present, or are found in some instance where the given nature is absent, or are found to increase in some instance where the given nature decreases, or to decrease where the given nature increases. Only when the process of exclusion has been completed will it be possible to grasp the true essence or form, or the true essence of the nature in question. Inductive method rests on several presuppositions. First, the first presupposition is that of the limited variety. There is a principle of limited variety. The world as we experience it appears unendingly varied, but all this complexity arises from the combination of a finite and small number of simple natures. There is an alphabet of nature. This alphabet cannot be guessed or discovered by speculation, but this alphabet can be revealed through the correct application of these empirical procedures and inductive reasoning. The principle of the direct correlation of forms and natures, that's another presupposition on which the use of inductive method is based. There's a direct one-to-one correlation between natures and the forms from which they arise. For example, the heat of the heavenly bodies and a fire, or the red in a rose and in a rainbow, are similar, and this similarity counts for their having the same causes in reality. And this way of thinking is related to the alchemical tradition, in which bodies were considered as collections of simple natures. Another presupposition: every body contains in itself many forms of natures unlimited, united together. Forms are seldom independent, since every body contains in itself many forms of natures united together in a concrete state. The result is that they severely crush, depress, break, and enthrall one another. Thus, the individual forms are obscured. Forms are not, however, hidden altogether, since expansion is part of the form of heat. All heated bodies must expand. But while the expansion of air is unnoticed, that of iron is less manifest to the senses. So the use of the inductive method prescribes the extraction of the essential from the non-essential and the discovery of the underlying structure or form of the phenomena under investigation. And this is obtained through the comparison of instances, study of concomitant variations, and exclusion of negative instances. And this process is facilitated by the choice of prerogative of solitary instances in which the investigated data are comparatively isolated and unadulterated. But under the most favorable conditions, inquiry must be cautious, laborious, step-by-step affair. And results can never be more than provisional because of the possibility of undiscovered negative instances. So Bacon had no system of his own, but openly preferred the Ionists, Atomists, and Epicureans, and he developed the ideas of those classical thinkers and interpreted them by putting them in a new context, the context of modern intellectual tradition. John Locke contributed greatly to the development of empiricism. John Locke was a leading figure in the empiricist tradition. He was an English philosopher of the age of reason and early age of enlightenment, and his ideas had enormous influence on the development of epistemology and political philosophy, and he is widely regarded as one of the most influential early Enlightenment thinkers. We should consider mostly John Locke's epistemology. What is the fundamental principle of John Locke's epistemology or theory of knowledge? He explicated those principles in his fundamental work entitled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. It was published in 1790. So An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which was published in 1790, was the culmination of 20 years of reflection on the origins of human knowledge. Locke realized that knowledge is a fundamentally different phenomenon from belief, and Locke holds that knowledge is typically accompanied by belief, It is now, though, to be identified with belief. Knowledge is direct awareness of some fact. Belief, by contrast, consists of taking some proposition to be true, whether or not one is directly aware of the corresponding fact. Of what sorts of facts do we human beings have direct awareness? So Locke's answer is all of facts that consist of relationships among our ideas. Knowledge is the perception of the relationship between our ideas. And Locke regarded ideas as mental objects. Locke regarded some ideas as being representations of other entities. So in Locke's view, the mind begins as tabula rasa. It begins as a blank state in which experience brings ideas via the senses and reflections. So all ideas are acquired by two kinds of experience. Sensations are the impressions of our senses leave on the mind. Reflection is the mind's experience of its own operations while dealing with sensation. Simple sensations or reflections combine to form complex ideas. And Locke claims that the only input is ideas of sensation and reflection. The mind works on ideas of sensation and reflection by such operations as combination, division, generalization, and abstraction. There are no innate ideas. Locke argued against the principle of innate knowledge. The mind is furnished with ideas by experience alone. Thus, our knowledge is limited to our experience of the world. We have no knowledge of what underlies experience. Thus, we have no rational knowledge of what mind and matter are. This is in contrast to Descartes, who believed that we can know for sure the structure of reality and explicate it in terms of distinct substances. For Locke, we know the nominal sense, not the real essence of matter. We can never know the inner nature of the things around us, only their behavior and the way in which they affect us and other things. And Locke saw the properties of things as being of two distinct kinds. There are primary qualities and secondary qualities. The real inner natures of things derive from the primary qualities, such as extension, solidity, and motion, for instance. Secondary qualities. Our knowledge of material substances depends heavily on these secondary qualities, such as color and sound, or just feeling the odor of something. But these secondary qualities are mind-dependent, and they are of a sensory or qualitative nature. Take, for instance, John Locke's account of the idea of whiteness in mind. For instance, I'm looking at this white sheet of paper, and I've got this impression of the idea of whiteness in my mind. It's a simple idea of sensations. And the idea of whiteness, as John Locke notes, is the sign of some unknown cause, something which causes me to feel like this. Implicitly, of course, he believed in some atomic interactions, the atoms of external objects and the atoms of my body. But the explicit knowledge should be based on the experience. And what is given to us in experience can be taken as, of course, being produced by some causes. But the knowledge of these causes seems to be problematic. Let's turn to George Berkeley. George Berkeley gave radical interpretation to some of the ideas of John Locke, specifically the idea of secondary qualities, and he, for instance, reduced primary qualities to the secondary qualities. The status of primary qualities was put into doubt and he treated the primary qualities as being mind independent as well as secondary qualities. Bishop George Berkeley was another empiricist, and his empiricism was a much more radical kind. George Berkeley's most important philosophical work was entitled A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. Berkeley developed a rather counterintuitive system known as immaterialism. Now we can qualify it as an instance of subjective idealism. Berkeley developed a revolutionary theory that objects exist only as perception and not as matter separate from perception. Underlying reality consists exclusively of minds and their ideas, and individuals can only directly know these ideas or perceptions for experience, and this theory was summed up in his dictum: esse est percip, to be is to be perceived. An object only really exists if someone is there to see or sense it. To be is to be perceived, although the infinite mind of God perceives everything all the time, and so in this respect the objects continue to exist. So this theory is called immaterialism. And as I've already told you, Berkeley reduced the status of primary qualities to that of secondary qualities. Primary qualities, such as extension, they were seen as being mind-dependent as well as secondary qualities. Reality consists exclusively of minds and their ideas. Individuals can only directly know sensations and ideas, not the objects themselves. The only phenomena of which we are aware are sensations and ideas. And for instance, if I have an apple in my hand, there's a cluster of sensations. Sensations of roundness, redness, sweet taste and good smell and so on. So that's a collection of sensations. All of our ideas, including those of sensible objects, are derived from sense experience. We never actually experience matter. Thus we can have no idea of matter. The very idea of matter, according to George Berkeley, is inconceivable, unintelligible. Matter is a posit held to unify the very simple ideas of sensible particulars or objects. Because matter is never experienced and is only posited as an occult substratum, Berkeley applies Occam's razor and eliminates it as an unnecessary premise. If all sensible objects are actually ideas, then ideas must have a substratum in which they can reside, and this substratum is mind or spirit. Thus, all of the objects of our experience are ideas in minds. This view led George Berkeley to the ultimate position, which is philosophically qualified as subjective idealism. The position that the mind is the only thing that can be known to exist, and that knowledge of anything outside the mind is unjustified, is known as solipsism. But he's not a solipsist because he allowed for the existence of God, the God who perceives everything all the time. He's a typical subjective idealist, and this is an extreme type of empiricism. And finally, let's turn to David Hume. David Hume was the greatest figure among the British empiricists. Hume believed strongly that human experience is as close wherever point going to get to the truth, and that experience and observation must be the foundations of any logical argument. David Hume argued that although we may form beliefs and make inductive inferences about things outside our experience by means of instinct, imagination, and custom, they cannot be conclusively established by reason. We shouldn't make any claims to certain knowledge about things outside our experience. Hume found that the idea of God effectively nonsensical, given that there is no way of arriving at the idea through sensory data, and Hume attacked many of the basic assumptions of religion and gave many of the classic criticism of some of the arguments for the existence of gods. In his political philosophy, David Hume stressed the importance of moderation, and his work contains elements of both conservatism and liberalism. Let's consider David Hume's epistemology. Hume's major philosophical works were a treatise of human nature and inquiry concerning human understanding. First, let's consider David Hume's views on the sources of knowledge. All of human knowledge can be divided into two categories: relations of ideas, mathematical and logical propositions, and matters of fact, propositions involving some contingent observation of world, such as the sun rises in the east, and that ideas are derived from our impressions or sensations. Next, David Hume articulated a kind of skeptical attitude. We believe that there is indeed an independently existing world of material objects causally interacting with each other, which we perceive and represent to ourselves through our senses. But Hume's point was that none of this could be actually proved. Hume admitted that we can form beliefs about that which extends beyond any possible experience through the operation of faculties such as custom and imagination, but Hume was entirely skeptical about any claims to knowledge on this basis. Hume is known for his demonstration of the fact that we are not capable of getting certain knowledge of causal relations between events, and this doubt now is presented by the historians of philosophy under the general label such as the problem of induction. What is the problem of induction? That is the problem of exactly how we are able to make inductive inferences, specifically how those inferences can help us to get knowledge of the causes of the events. Humans tend to believe that things behave in a regular manner and that patterns in the behavior of objects will persist into the future and throughout the unobserved present. That is called the principle of the uniformity of nature. And Hume argued forcefully that such a belief cannot be justified other than by the very sort of reasoning that is under question, that is induction, which would be circular reasoning. So Hume introduces the problem of induction as part of an analysis of the notions of cause and effect. And for Hume, the relation of causation is the only relation by means of which we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses, so beyond our actual experiences. Hume argues that we can not make a causal inference by purely a priori means, rather it is based on our experience, and specifically experience of constant conjunction. What is the basis of this kind of inference? If such an inference is made by a chain of reasoning, it is crucially important to know what the reasoning is. According to Hume, our inference depends on interposition of the form. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect, and I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. So in his treatise, Hume says that if reason determine us, it will proceed upon the principle that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same. This claim of similarity or resemblance between observed and unobserved regularities is referred to as the uniformity principle, or the principle of uniformity of nature. We claim that the instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experiences on the basis of the general assumption about the uniformity of nature, that nature continues always uniformly. Now let's consider David Hume's argument. Which is really indicative of the problem of induction. In order for someone to have reason to believe any matter-of-fact claim about the unobserved, he or she must have some reason to believe that the uniformity principle, or the principle of the uniformity of nature, is true. And that is what we actually do when we make inferences, when we make conclusions on the assumptions about the resemblance between the cases which we have already observed and the cases which, of which we haven't had any experience yet. And that is what is going on when we make inductive inferences in order to get the knowledge of the causes of things. So, in order for someone to have reason to believe any matter-of-fact claim about the unobserved, he or she must first have reason to believe that the uniformity principle is true, and the uniformity principle requires this: for an inductive argument to be successful, past performance must at least resemble the future results in ways that make generalizations about those future results possible. All claims are either relations of ideas claims or matter-of-fact claims. Matter-of-fact claims can be either true or false, and relations of ideas claims are made true by the concepts or ideas they involve. They are claims you can know without going out into the world and checking. These are typical analytical statements. Next stage in this argument, in the development of this argument, the uniformity principle is not a relations of ideas claim. There is nothing about the meaning of the ideas involved in the claim that the unobserved instances resemble observed instances that would guarantee the truth of the claim. Moreover, it implies no contradiction that the course of nature may change and that an object similarly like those which we have experienced may be attended with different or contra effects. Because the uniformity principle says that unobserved instances resemble observed instances, that means that the uniformity principle is a claim about the unobserved. Because the uniformity principle is itself a matter-of-fact claim about the unobserved, that means that in order for you just to have reason to believe that the uniformity principle is true, you must already have reason to believe that the uniformity principle is true. But the support for the uniformity principle comes from the uniformity principle itself. So the justification for the uniformity principle is viciously circular. And we base our inductive reasonings, we base our inductive inferences for which we intend to get the knowledge of the causes of events on the assumption that the uniformity principle is true, but our justification of the uniformity principle turns out to be visually circular. And if that's the case, then we have no good non-circular reason for believing in the conclusions of inductive arguments. And Hume concludes, thus not only our reason fails us in the discovery of the ultimate connection of causes and effects, but even after experience has informed us of their constant conjunction, it's impossible for us to satisfy ourselves by our reason. Why should extend that experience beyond those particular instances which have fallen under our own observation? The conclusion then is that our tendency to project past regularities into the future is not under or being by reason. It doesn't have any rational justification. The problem of induction is to find a way to avoid this conclusion despite Hume's argument. And Hume claims that it is natural instinct rather than reason that explains our ability to make inductive inferences. If one has seen similar objects or events constantly conjoined, then the mind is inclined to expect a similar regularity to hold in the near future. And the tendency or propensity to draw such inferences is the effect of our custom, Having found in many instances that any two kinds of objects, flame and heat, snow and cold, have always been conjoined together. If a flame or snow be presented anew to the senses, the mind is carried by custom to expect heat or cold, and to believe that such a quality does exist and will discover itself upon a near approach. Now, this belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances. So Hume argues that the fact that these inductive inferences do follow the course of nature is a kind of pre-established harmony. It is a kind of natural instinct which may in fact be more effective in making us successful in the world than if we relied on reason to make these inferences. That is the problem in induction, and Hume's skepticism and his negative results with regard to the capabilities of human mind to get the knowledge of the causes of events through a set of inductive inferences turned out to be a real challenge to the very idea of scientific progress. And it was Immanuel Kant who tried to restore the positions of natural science and philosophical metaphysics, and to reconcile rationalism with empiricism on the basis of the idea of a priori transcendental foundations of our knowledge. Thank you for your attention. That's all for today.